The date was the 22nd of September, 1920. It was a Wednesday, a day that would soon be etched into the memory of County Clare with fire and with blood. In the west of Ireland, along a winding coastal road between the small villages of Milltown Malbay and Ennistaimon, history was waiting. This particular stretch of road, known locally as Rineen, was surrounded by boggy fields and low stone walls. It was an isolated place, a quiet place, but it had been chosen for a specific and violent purpose. On one side stood the men of the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. They were local volunteers, farmers and shopkeepers, fighting for an independent Ireland. On the other side were the men of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, who represented the authority of the British Crown in Ireland. Their paths were set to cross on this lonely road, and the encounter would become one of the most infamous episodes of the entire Irish War of Independence. This conflict, which had been raging for over a year, was not a war of grand armies and sprawling battlefields. Instead, it was a guerrilla war, fought in the shadows, down country lanes, and in the heart of small communities. The IRA, hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned by the might of the British Empire, relied on ambushes and swift surprise attacks. Their goal was to make Ireland ungovernable, to disrupt British administration at every turn, and to show the world that the Irish people would not yield. The Rineen Ambush was a textbook example of this strategy. It was planned retaliation for the killing of an IRA volunteer, a symbol of the escalating cycle of violence that had gripped the country. The volunteers of the Mid Clare Brigade of the IRA gathered at Rineen with a singular deadly objective to attack a British patrol and strike a blow for their cause. The forces arrayed against them were a mixture of traditional police and new, more formidable paramilitaries. The Royal Irish Constabulary, once an accepted part of Irish life, was now seen by many as an occupying force. Its numbers were bolstered by British recruits, known as the Black and Tans for their mismatched uniforms of dark green police tunics and khaki military trousers. They had quickly earned a reputation for brutality and indiscipline. Alongside them were the auxiliaries, a force of ex-British Army officers, even more hardened and often more ruthless. It was a lorry carrying these RIC men that the IRA planned to attack. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only decide the fate of the men involved, but would also send shockwaves far beyond the quiet fields of Rineen. The ambush was a gamble, a dangerous and audacious plan conceived by local IRA commanders. They knew the risks were enormous. Success depended on surprise, timing, and the swift execution of their attack. Failure could mean death or capture for every man involved, yet they were driven by a powerful sense of duty and a burning desire for freedom. They believed that only through armed struggle could they achieve their dream of an Irish republic, and so, on that September morning, they lay in wait, hidden behind the stone walls, their rifles and shotguns ready. The air was still, but it was filled with a palpable tension. The quiet road at Rineen was about to become a crucible of the Irish Revolution, a place where the bitter struggle for a nation's soul would be laid bare for all to see. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this. The Irish War of Independence did not erupt overnight. It was the culmination of centuries of unrest and a powerful resurgence of Irish nationalism in the early 20th century. In County Clare, as in the rest of Ireland, the desire for self-determination ran deep. The men who joined the Irish Republican Army were not professional soldiers. They were ordinary men propelled by extraordinary circumstances. They saw the British presence in their country as an occupation, and the Royal Irish Constabulary as its enforcers. The IRA in Clare, particularly the Mid Clare Brigade, had become one of the most active and effective units in the entire country. They had organized themselves into a disciplined, if poorly equipped, guerrilla force, dedicated to disrupting British rule through any means necessary. This period saw a dramatic escalation of violence. The IRA targeted RIC barracks, raided for arms, and ambushed patrols, making daily life for the police increasingly perilous. In response, the British government flooded the country with reinforcements. The arrival of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries marked a turning point in the conflict. These were not traditional policemen, they were battle-hardened veterans of the Great War, brought to Ireland to make war on the rebels. Their tactics were often brutal and indiscriminate, blurring the line between policing and military reprisal. This created a vicious cycle. An IRA attack would be followed by a swift and often violent British response, which in turn fueled local anger and drove more young men into the arms of the IRA. The specific catalyst for the Rineen ambush was the death of Martin Devitt, an IRA captain. He was captured and killed by British forces at Crow's Bridge near the village of Inagh, just days before. The leadership of the IRA's Mid Clare Brigade felt compelled to respond. An act of retaliation was not just a matter of revenge, it was a strategic necessity. They needed to demonstrate that the killing of their officers would not go unpunished. They needed to maintain morale among their own men and show the civilian population that the IRA was still a force to be reckoned with. The decision was made to mount a major ambush, the largest one the brigade had yet attempted, to send a clear and bloody message to the Crown forces. The target was chosen carefully. The IRA's intelligence network, which relied on sympathetic locals and contacts within the postal and railway systems, had learned that an RIC lorry regularly traveled the road between Ennistimon and Milltown Malbay. This lorry, a Crossley tender, was a symbol of British mobility and power. To destroy it would be a significant propaganda victory. The location at Rineen was ideal for an ambush. The road narrowed, offering a clear field of fire from the high ground on either side. The plan was bold, and the stakes were incredibly high. The volunteers knew they would be facing well-armed policemen, but for them, the fight for Ireland's freedom was worth any price, and the death of Martin Devitt demanded a reckoning. At the heart of the Rineen ambush were the men of the IRA's 4th Battalion, Mid Clare Brigade. They were led by Ignatius O'Neill, the battalion commander, a veteran of the Easter Rising who brought a degree of military experience to the operation. He and his comrades were not a faceless mob. They were individuals deeply embedded in their local communities. Men like Seamus Hennessy and Paik Lehane were known figures, their commitment to the Republican cause unwavering. They gathered approximately 50 volunteers for the ambush, a significant number for a rural IRA unit. A few modern Lee-Enfield rifles captured from the British, older Martini rifles, a handful of shotguns, and some pistols. They were short on ammunition and had no heavy weapons, a stark contrast to the enemy they were about to face. On the other side were the men of the Royal Irish Constabulary. The patrol that was targeted consisted of 6 men traveling in a Crossley tender lorry. They were led by a sergeant, Michael Hines. These were not black and tans, but regular RIC constables, 4 of whom were Irishmen. In the polarized world of 1920, their position was an unenviable one. To the British authorities, they were the front line in the battle against rebellion. To the IRA and a growing portion of the Irish population, they were collaborators, traitors to their own people. They drove their routes under constant threat, knowing that any journey could be their last. On that September day, their routine patrol from Ennistimon was taking them directly into a carefully prepared trap, a fate they could not have possibly foreseen as they set out that afternoon. A third key figure entered the story by a tragic twist of fate, Alan Lendrum. He was a 63-year-old resident magistrate, a local judicial official appointed by the British administration. Lendrum was a former army officer and a staunch unionist, a man who represented the old Anglo-Irish establishment that the IRA was fighting to overthrow. On the day of the ambush, he was traveling from his home in Kilkee to Ennistimon to preside over a court session. He was driving his own car and, being a cousin of a British general, was known to carry a service revolver for his own protection. His journey, entirely separate from the ARIC patrol, would tragically intersect with the IRA's operation, adding another layer of complexity and consequence to the day's events. These 3 groups, the determined IRA volunteers, the beleaguered RIC patrol, and the unwitting magistrate, were on a collision course. Each represented a different facet of the fractured society of 1920s Ireland. The volunteers were fighting for a new future, a sovereign Irish republic, free from British influence. The RIC men were caught in the middle, upholding a system that was crumbling around them, and Alan Lendrum embodied the old order, the system of British law and administration that the IRA was determined to smash. Their convergence on a quiet stretch of road in County Clare would ignite a firestorm of violence, reprisal, and recrimination, the echoes of which would resonate for decades to come. As the afternoon of the 22nd of September wore on, the IRA volunteers lay in their concealed positions on both sides of the road at Rineen. Their commander, Ignatius O'Neill, had placed his men strategically. Those with the most reliable rifles were given key vantage points, while men with shotguns, effective only at close range, were positioned nearer to the road. The plan was simple. wait for the RIC lorry to enter the designated killing zone, then open fire simultaneously from all sides. A signal, a whistle blast, would initiate the attack. The hours passed slowly, the men were tense, their senses heightened, listening for the telltale sound of the lorry's engine. Every minute of waiting stretched their nerves, but their discipline held. They were committed to the plan and to each other. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the silence, but it was not the heavy rumble of a lorry, it was the lighter sound of a motor car. As the car came into view, the volunteers identified it as belonging to Alan Lendrum, the resident magistrate. He was a known figure, and to the IRA, a legitimate target as an official of the British administration. As he drove into their ambush position, the order was given. A volley of shots rang out, shattering the car's windows and puncturing its tires. The vehicle swerved violently and crashed into a ditch. The initial plan had been disrupted, but the situation had to be managed. A small party of volunteers, led by Ignatius O'Neill himself, cautiously approached the stricken vehicle to secure the magistrate and his weapon. What happened next at Lendrum's car is shrouded in the confusion of the moment. The IRA's account states that as they approached, Lendrum emerged from the car with his revolver drawn and opened fire, wounding one of the volunteers. In the ensuing exchange of shots, Alan Lendrum was killed. The volunteers quickly removed his body from the road, hiding it in a nearby culvert to avoid alarming the approaching RIC patrol. They took his pistol and returned to their positions, the tension now even higher. They had not planned for this, but the primary objective remained. The brief, sharp burst of violence was over, and an eerie quiet fell over the roadside once more as they reset their trap. Minutes later, the sound they had been waiting for finally arrived. The RIC's Crossley tender lorry chugged into view, carrying the 6 constables. It slowed as it approached the spot where Lendrum's abandoned car was skewed across the road. As the lorry drew to a halt, the RIC men inside peering out with suspicion, the whistle blew. The air exploded with the deafening crash of dozens of rifles and shotguns firing at once. The ambush was executed with devastating precision. The canvas cover of the lorry was shredded by bullets, and the men inside were given no chance to react or take cover. The initial volley was overwhelming, a storm of lead that swept through the open-backed vehicle from multiple directions, turning the quiet road into a scene of carnage. The IRA's initial volley was brutally effective. The 6 RIC men in the Crossley tender were caught in a deadly crossfire, with no time to return fire or even comprehend what was happening. Sergeant Michael Hines and 4 of the constables were killed almost instantly. Their bodies slumped inside the bullet-riddled lorry. One constable, though severely wounded, managed to survive the initial onslaught by dropping to the floor of the vehicle. Seeing the devastation they had wrought, the IRA volunteers ceased firing and emerged from their positions. They cautiously approached the lorry to confirm the outcome and to seize the valuable rifles and ammunition of the fallen policemen, a crucial objective in every such ambush. As the IRA men were gathering the weapons, the unexpected occurred. A lookout, posted further down the road towards Milltown Malbay, gave a frantic warning. A large convoy of British military lorries was approaching. It was a unit of 10 vehicles, carrying soldiers who had been engaged in a search for a missing officer miles away and were now returning to Ennistimon. Their arrival was a stroke of pure chance, a disastrous coincidence for the IRA. The ambush party, numbering around 50 men with light arms, was now faced with the prospect of being trapped and annihilated by over 100 heavily armed British soldiers. The small victory was about to turn into a desperate fight for survival. Ignatius O'Neill immediately ordered a retreat. The volunteers, their objective only partially complete, scattered. They abandoned the RIC lorry and the captured weapons, their only thought now being to escape the closing net. They fled across the open bogland, a difficult terrain that offered little cover. The British soldiers, seeing the smoking lorry and the fleeing figures, dismounted and gave chase, opening fire with the Southern with the Southern and machine guns, and Napper and Mahdi guns. A running battle ensued, stretching for several miles across the marshes and hills. The IRA men used their knowledge of the local landscape to their advantage, making for the safety of the Slieve Callan Hills, but the soldiers were relentless in their pursuit. Miraculously, the vast majority of the IRA unit managed to escape. Despite the intensity of the chase and the superior firepower of the British military, the volunteers' familiarity with the bogs and their sheer determination to get away saved them. Only one IRA volunteer, Paik Lehane, was killed during the chaotic retreat. A few others were wounded, but the main body of the ambush party melted away into the countryside. The British soldiers, frustrated at their inability to catch the main force, called off the pursuit as dusk began to fall. They returned to the scene of the ambush to find the destroyed RIC lorry, the bodies of the 5 constables and the abandoned car of the magistrate Alan Lendrum, whose own body was still hidden from view. The discovery of the ambush and the deaths of 5 RIC constables sent a shockwave of fury through the British forces stationed in County Clare. The soldiers who had stumbled upon the scene were soon joined by lorry loads of black and tans and auxiliaries from nearby towns. What followed was not a police investigation or a military operation. It was an explosion of collective and indiscriminate rage. The forces of the Crown, frustrated by their losses and their inability to strike a decisive blow against the elusive IRA, turned their anger on the only target they could find, the local civilian population and their homes. That night, a wave of terror and destruction, which would become known as the Terror in Clare, was unleashed. The reprisals began in the nearest towns and villages. In Ennistimon and Lahinch, lorry loads of black and tans and soldiers roared through the streets, firing their rifles indiscriminately into houses and at anyone they saw. They broke into homes, dragging people out, beating them, and setting their properties alight. The town hall in Lahinch was burnt to the ground. Pubs, shops, and private homes were looted and then set ablaze with petrol. The night was filled with the sounds of gunfire, shattering glass, and the screams of terrified families fleeing the flames. The forces of law and order had become a lawless mob, exacting a terrible revenge on a community they held collectively responsible for the ambush. The rampage continued into the surrounding countryside, moving towards Milltown Malbay. Along the way, any farmhouse or cottage suspected of housing Republican sympathizers, or simply any that was unlucky enough to be in their path, was targeted. Hay barns, creameries, and livestock were destroyed, striking at the very heart of the rural economy. In Milltown Malbay itself, the reprisals were particularly savage. More homes and businesses were burned. In one of the most brutal acts of the night, Crown forces captured 2 local men, Paddy McInerney and Sean Keane, and summarily executed them, their bodies left on the side of the road as a grim warning to others. Another civilian was shot and killed in his own home. By the time the sun rose on the 23rd of September, the landscape of West Clare was scarred and traumatized. Several towns and villages lay partially in ruins, with smoke still rising from the embers of dozens of buildings. 6 innocent civilians were dead, countless others were injured, and hundreds were left homeless and destitute. The official reprisals, as they were called, were intended to crush the spirit of the rebellion and terrorize the population into submission. However, their effect was precisely the opposite. The brutality of the black and tans and the auxiliaries horrified the community, erased any lingering sympathy for the British administration, and hardened the resolve of the people to support the IRA's fight for independence. The events at Rineen and the subsequent rampage by Crown forces could not be contained within the borders of County Clare. News of the ambush and the brutal reprisals quickly spread, first through the Irish press and then to the wider world. Irish nationalist newspapers depicted the burnings and killings as a calculated policy of terror sanctioned by the British government. They published harrowing eyewitness accounts from the people of Lahinch, Ennistimon, and Milltown Malbay, detailing the destruction of their homes and the murder of their neighbors. These stories painted a damning picture of the forces sent to keep the peace in Ireland, portraying them as violent thugs who acted without discipline or restraint. The British and Unionist press, however, told a different story. They focused primarily on the ambush itself, condemning it as a cowardly and murderous act by a murder gang of rebels. The deaths of the RIC constables were highlighted, and the IRA was depicted as a purely criminal organization. The official line from Dublin Castle, the centre of British administration in Ireland, was to downplay or deny the reprisals. When the evidence of burned towns became undeniable, the official explanation was that the destruction was the result of the fighting itself, or that the buildings had been burned by the rebels to discredit Crown forces. These denials, however, were seen as increasingly implausible in the face of overwhelming evidence. the controversy inevitably reached the highest levels of government in London. In the House of Commons, members of the opposition Labour Party and the independent Asquithian Liberal Party relentlessly questioned the government about the actions of the Black and Tans. Irish nationalist MPs read out detailed accounts of the reprisals in Clare, demanding to know who was responsible. The Chief Secretary for Ireland, Sir Hamer Greenwood, was forced to defend his government's policy. He steadfastly denied that there was an official policy of reprisals, often blaming the destruction on the rebels themselves and praising the restraint of the Crown forces under extreme provocation. This created a fierce political storm, with many in Britain becoming deeply uneasy about the methods being used to maintain their rule in Ireland. The international press, particularly in the United States, also seized upon the story. American newspapers, fueled by a large and influential Irish-American population, published sensational reports of British atrocities in Ireland. The story of Rineen and ensuing aftermath became a powerful propaganda tool for the Irish Republic's representatives abroad, who used it to generate sympathy for their cause and to pressure the American government to recognize Irish independence. The contrast between the IRA's guerrilla attack and the state-sanctioned terror that followed it starkly illustrated the nature of the conflict, damaging Britain's moral standing on the world stage just 2 years after it had claimed to be fighting a war for the freedom of small nations. The Rineen Ambush and the ferocious reprisals that followed marked a significant turning point in the war, not just in County Clare but across Ireland. For the British, the event highlighted a critical failure in their strategy. Their forces, particularly the Black and Tans and auxiliaries, were proving to be a double-edged sword. While they were effective at intimidating the population, their lack of discipline and their tendency towards indiscriminate violence were creating more rebels than they were crushing. The burning of towns and the killing of civilians alienated even moderate Irish nationalists who might otherwise have been wary of the IRA's campaign. The reprisals were a public relations disaster, undermining British authority both at home and abroad. In the aftermath, the British military command began to implement tactical changes. They recognized that sending small, isolated patrols in unarmored lorries down predictable routes was an invitation for disaster. Following Rineen, patrols were strengthened, often traveling in larger multi-vehicle convoys with armored cars for protection. They began to adopt more formal counterinsurgency tactics, such as establishing martial law in the most rebellious counties, including Clare. This meant that civilians could be tried by military courts. The British were slowly learning that they could not police their way out of a guerrilla war. They had to fight it like a war, with military discipline and strategy, rather than with undisciplined and counterproductive terror. For the local population in Clare, the events surrounding Rineen crystallized their attitudes towards the conflict. Any ambiguity or neutrality was burned away in the fires of Lahinch and Milltown Malbay. The brutal actions of the Crown forces demonstrated to them that the British state saw them not as subjects to be protected, but as an enemy population to be subdued. This drove them further into the arms of the IRA, increasing the flow of intelligence, shelter, and new recruits to the Republican cause. The community's resilience in the face of such terror strengthened their collective resolve. They saw the IRA volunteers not as criminals, but as their protectors and the only hope for a future free from such oppression. The IRA, too, learned lessons from Rineen. The ambush itself was a tactical success, demonstrating their ability to plan and execute a major attack. However, the narrow escape from a much larger British force highlighted the inherent risks of their operations. The randomness of war, the chance arrival of that military convoy, showed how quickly a victory could turn into a catastrophe. Future operations would have to account for even more meticulous planning regarding escape routes and the potential for rapid enemy reinforcement. Rineen became a case study for IRA commanders across the country, a powerful example of both the potential and the perils of guerrilla warfare against a powerful empire. In the immediate aftermath of the ambush and the chaotic running battle, the body of the resident magistrate, Alan Lendrum, remained undiscovered by the British forces. It had been hastily hidden by the IRA in a culvert by the roadside. Several days later, with the British military conducting a massive search for the missing magistrate, the local IRA command realized the danger his undiscovered body posed. They feared that if it were found near the ambush site, it would trigger another, perhaps even more vicious, wave of reprisals against the local community. To prevent this, a decision was made to move the body and give it a proper burial in a secret location. Under the cover of darkness, a party of IRA volunteers returned to the scene. They retrieved Alan Lendrum's body and transported it several miles away to a remote, unconsecrated children's burial ground known as a Cillin in the townland of Caherpheanic, near Cree. There, they dug a grave and buried him. It was a clandestine act, born of a grim necessity to protect the local people from further harm. The location of his grave remained a secret held by a select few for several years. It was only in 1924, after the end of the War of Independence and the subsequent Irish Civil War, that members of the former IRA unit revealed the location to his family, allowing for his remains to be exhumed and reinterred in a family plot. The legacy of the Rineen Ambush is complex and enduring. It stands as a stark example of the brutality of the Irish War of Independence, a microcosm of the entire conflict. It involved a successful IRA guerrilla attack, a chance encounter with military reinforcements, and a savage, indiscriminate reprisal by Crown forces. The events of that day and the night that followed demonstrated the escalating cycle of violence that had consumed Ireland. It laid bare the strategies and motivations of both sides, the IRA's determination to win freedom through armed struggle, and the British Empire's willingness to use terror to maintain control. Today, the site of the ambush is marked by a memorial. Erected by the people of Clare in 1956, it is a simple stone monument in the shape of a Celtic cross, standing vigil by the side of the N67 road. It bears an inscription in both Irish and English, commemorating the men of the Mid Clare Brigade who fought there. The memorial serves as a quiet, powerful reminder of the events of September 22, 1920. It honors the memory of the IRA volunteers who fought and died for their vision of an independent Ireland, and it stands as a testament to a pivotal moment when the fury of a revolution erupted on a lonely coastal road, changing the course of a community and a nation forever.